The words critical race theory crop up in plenty of headlines these days. What is this theory? Why should we care? The John Locke Foundation addresses these questions and others in a new critical race theory primer. And joining us now is co-author Dr. Terry Stoops. He is the director of the Center for Effective Education at the John Locke Foundation. And Terry, we're going to focus this interview on what has happened since critical race theory emerged. And you want to start with critical race theory going to law school.
That's right. There was a movement in the 1970s to try to think about the gains or the failures of the civil rights movement. And there was consensus starting to build, especially among law professors, that despite the tremendous gains in rights for African Americans, that the civil rights movement was largely a failure. And so to try to understand that failure and to understand why it occurred, they developed something called critical legal studies or critical legal theory that tried to talk about some of the underlying causes for the failure of the civil rights movement to really end racism in the United States. And the conclusion that they came to is that the legal system inherently features systems and rules and laws in place that either explicitly or implicitly work on racialized grounds. That means that they essentially work to reinforce the rights and privileges of white citizens at the expense of black citizens and citizens of color. So this was something that had circulated through law schools in the 1970s, 1980s, and 1990s, and specifically starting in the 1970s with Harvard Law School and a scholar named Derek Bell, who really created the foundation of critical legal studies or critical legal theory that became critical race theory in the 1980s and the 1990s.
And then critical race theory eventually moved on to education schools and education?
Yeah, that's right. So really in the mid-1990s, we start to see education scholars, Gloria Ladstone Billings in particular, start talking about the idea of critical race theory being something that needed to apply to education research. Now, the reasoning here is that if the legal system, if legal institutions were inherently racist, then maybe educational institutions were inherently racist. And so given that premise, you can imagine that in the mid-90s, there were education scholars in trying to explain the disparities and outcomes in our education system, saw this as a very plausible explanation for why African American students had traditionally performed at a level much lower than their white counterparts. And so in the mid-90s, we have theory really starting to rise up in education schools. Now, this didn't really start to manifest itself in teacher training until the 2000s. It took a little while for the theory to become part of the education scholarship, and then for that education scholarship to filter down into teacher training. But it did. And today, teacher training in many, especially large research universities, feature a critical race theory component. In fact, I talk about some of that in the primer.
So there's been some discussion about critical race theory in the schools, in the K-12 schools, and some people say, oh, no one's teaching critical race theory in the schools. It sounds as if you're saying they don't need to teach the theory has informed their teaching.
That's right. Teacher training has a critical race theory component. And we hear a lot about individuals saying, well, they're not teaching critical race theory. No, they're not going back to the Derek Bell and reading his original discussions about some of these race issues or Gloria Ladstone Billings, but there are elements of critical race theory that have made their way into schools of education. One of the examples that I provide in the primer is that NC State's School of Education there were three English language arts professors in the School of Education that talked about their approach to teacher training and how they integrate critical race theory into it. And what they do is they encourage all of their white students to consider their own biases, their implicit and explicit biases about people of color. Ask white students to examine how those biases, the supposed biases, would manifest themselves in the classroom and what they're going to do about it as teachers. And so there's this whole idea of psychological exploration, specifically with white teachers, that schools of education ask them to explore. There's also this idea about how to punish students who misbehave in the classroom. There was a time where the assumption was that you have to find an appropriate way to mitigate student misbehavior in the classroom and then find appropriate punishments for them. But under a critical race theory framework where teachers have implicit biases against certain races, students of certain races, and those biases manifest themselves in the classroom, leading to disparities in how students are punished. Now there's a whole different approach to how students are punished for misbehavior, whereas some students in certain races get different treatment compared to students from other races based on the historical trends in who has been punished more for infractions in the classroom. So there's a lot of interesting ways that critical race theory appears in schools of education and in classrooms in ways that have nothing to do with the curriculum. And I think if you read anything from the primer, especially from the way that critical race theory is present in public schools, you start to recognize that it's not just about curriculum. It's not just the way that content is taught, but it is the fundamental structures of the way we operate a school system that borrows from a lot of critical race theory concepts.
The title is Critical Race Theory, a John Locke Foundation primer. Its co-author is Dr. Terry Stoops, director of the Center for Effective Education at the John Locke Foundation. Terry, thanks so much.
Thank you.